Welcome, everyone, to our third and final live stream in our special live stream series here at The Real News, co-produced with our friends at Project Censored, the Long Sili-CON, Power and Censorship in the Digital Era. If y'all have been with us for the past 2 weeks, then you know that we have been hosting these really incredible and thoughtful and lively panels that I've been truly honored to be a part of with brilliant thinkers, activists, and scholars who can help us sort of navigate some of the thorniest, but also some of the most essential questions that I think all of us should be asking of ourselves and of the digital world that we inhabit, right? I mean, the first panel that we did was focused on the question, can freedom exist in the digital era? And then the second panel was about whether or not we could have democracy in the digital era. And if you think about it, 20 years ago, you know, if we would have known 20 years ago that these were the questions we were going to be asking in the digital age, right? That would have clashed with the techno-utopian dreams that so many of us had about what the digital era would mean, what the internet and the digital technologies that would become part of our daily lives would allow us to do. Right. Obviously, as we all know, when the bright digital future and the techno-utopian dream of, a more open, more free, and more democratic way of living made possible by the digital era has given way to a reality in which the technologies that we depend on have largely been weaponized against us to surveil, condition, control, and exploit us in ever more sophisticated ways. And so in this panel, we want to ask some of the questions that we should be asking, but often we're so deeply imbricated in these digital networks that we don't think to ask them. Was this all inevitable? Was this the only form that the digital future could take? And is there a way out? Right? What alternative futures for ourselves and for the digital world should we be fighting for? And what role should independent media play in that fight? And so today, those are kind of among the big questions that we're going to be discussing under the rubric, as you see above me here in the title of this panel, what could life and media be without surveillance capitalism? Right? As the great scholar Shoshana Zuboff, author of the book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, once wrote, quote, "It's impossible to imagine surveillance capitalism without the digital, but it's easy to imagine the digital without surveillance capitalism," end quote. And so today, I guess we're going to test that thesis and see just how easy it is to imagine a digital world that can be ripped back from the circuits of surveillance capitalism that dominates so much of our digital lives today and non-digital lives. And I could not be more honored and excited to be joined by our incredible panel who are going to help us kind of navigate these and other thorny questions. And before we even get going, I wanted to start by saying that we are sending all our love and solidarity to the Palestinian people right now who are under attack and experiencing in full view of the rest of the world the harsh brutality of apartheid. So with that in mind, with the stakes of all of this discussion and any others that we have in mind, I want to go around and have our amazing panelists introduce themselves and let you get to know them from their own words. So why don't we start clockwise? We'll go Brady Bunch style. So Manar, would you do the honors of introducing yourself to the audience?
Absolutely. Well, my name is Manar Muhawish Adli, and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Mint Press News. And I'm also the executive director and a host and a producer for Behind the Headlines.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Manar. We're honored to have you here. Nolan, what about yourself?
I'm Nolan Higdon. I'm a university lecturer of history and media studies and the author of The Anatomy of Fake News, and I participate in organizing the Long Sili-CON, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion with all of you tonight.
Let's see. We got our bottom left quadrant. Abby, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Hello, my name is Abby Martin. I am a journalist, founder of Media Roots News, co-host of Media Roots Radio with my brother Robbie, and the founder and host of The Empire Files, an investigative documentary series looking at issues through the lens of U.S. empire. Formerly on the board of Project Censored, and I'm very happy to be here today.
Well, again, thank you all so much. I won't gush too much, right? I mean, every panel that we've had has just been stellar and truly an event, and this one is absolutely no different. And so thank you all so much for taking time to be here. And as always, I wanted to give our Oz / my co-host behind the curtain, Mickey, a chance to introduce himself, and you'll be seeing more of Mickey later in the live stream. So Mickey, why don't you make sure that the audience knows that you're there?
Hello, everybody. Hi, I'm Mickey Huff. I'm a professor of history, social science, and journalism. I'm director of Project Censored, president of the Media Freedom Foundation, host the weekly public affairs show, the Project Censored Show, along with Nolan and Max and the great team at the Real News Network, Dwayne, Kayla, everybody. Big shout out to TM as well. We've put this together, this series. This is the third part of the series. We started with Andy Lee Roth, Allison Butler, John Wilson, Max Alvarez. You've been our host the whole time. In the second week, we were able to bring in Vina Dubal. We had Meredith Whitaker, Robin Anderson. And today, again, I have to say, another absolutely stunning lineup. Great intellect as well as activists. We have, of course, Abby Martin, Manar Mahawish Adley, and also Nolan Higdon. He was a big force behind the plan here. Also co-author with me of United States of Distraction. So I will be monitoring the YouTube chat area. I'll be herding the cats in there. I'm looking for questions and comments. And as always, we hope to get those in as we get down to the start into the next hour. So honored to be here. It's been a great series. Max, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I look forward to this evening's conversation. Thanks so much.
Hell yeah. Well, thank you, Mickey. And yeah, thank you, Mickey and Nolan and everyone at Project Censored who have helped us put this together. So as Mickey said, for those of you who are watching live right now, please post your questions for the panel in the live YouTube chat. And then when we get to the Q&A portion in the second half of this panel, Mickey's going to be presenting those to our esteemed panelists. Now, I guess why don't we start by setting the table a little bit, right? Because in many ways, the kind of title for this panel is really like the other ones. It's broad, almost too broad, right? I mean, but in a way, it does at least situate a sort of common concern for all the people who are on this panel, and I imagine many of the people who are watching, right? As you all heard in the introductions, all of us here have a lot of stake in this fight, right? Not just in our kind of daily lives like all of us do, where so much of our daily interactions and, methods of commerce and communication happen through digital channels and through digital technologies, but also all of us here in our political fights and in our professional fights and in our struggles for truth and independent journalism, right? We very much have a stake in the larger question of what could this world be if the digital technologies that we all depend on were not organized around the prerogatives of a global capitalist system that has found ways not only to surveil us in sophisticated ways, but to tie that surveillance to the logic of capitalism itself, right? And basically surveil us in ways that can exploit us, that can empower the few, and that can make money for a handful of people. So I wanted to go around the table and just ask all of us to maybe start offering what we can to give viewers a sense of what surveillance capitalism really is, or like how we should begin to understand it as something that, in fact, we all live with in our daily lives, even if we don't really know it, right? So I guess when you all hear the term surveillance capitalism, like what comes out in your mind? Like, what are the things that you start to focus on before you start zooming outwards? So Nolan, I'm going to start with you. How does the kind of term surveillance capitalism, what does it do for you, and how does it perhaps apply in the work that you do?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I think it's it would help us a lot if we offered some sort of like scaffolding to it. And I think the title of these panel sessions really fits, right? The Long Sili-CON. Well, the con of surveillance capitalism has to do with the power dynamic. So I think when we talk about surveillance capitalism, one kind of helpful way to understand is to disentangle the feelings of power that we have as a digital media user from the actual power that exists on these platforms. So as a user, we're told, right, that by signing into Facebook or going to our Twitter app, we have the power to establish and strengthen democracy. We can hold the powerful accountable. We can access and create boundless amounts of information. But the reality is that these platforms are designed in a way where the power is actually concentrated in the hands of those that own the platforms. And so they're the ones who determine what content appears, what content does not appear, when it appears, how it appears, all those kinds of decisions. So when you're using these platforms, you're actually strengthening big tech. And this is the economic model that shapes how these decisions are made in Silicon Valley. So in essence, Silicon Valley has found a way to make platforms that draw people in. They used a lot of techniques from like the gambling industry that make you feel these little like dopamine rushes of happiness. Whenever you get a notification, whenever you get a like, whenever you get a new email, you suddenly feel like something great is happening. And it almost becomes addictive in that you keep refreshing your screen and rechecking your email, hoping for that next dopamine hit. We mistakenly discuss these tools as if they're free, right? We always say like they're free access to information, free access to our email, et cetera, et cetera. That's not true. Actually, we give up something, and Shoshana Zuboff reminds us of this. The cost is ourselves. We are the product. We provide the free labor. We provide the data. We provide the clicks for purchasing, all those kinds of things. So surveillance capitalism has essentially created a model whereby the humans are the product, and everything that a human can give in terms of data, behaviors, and attitudes are profitable. So that's why you see, whenever you hear the word smart, that generally means it's surveilling on you. Smart TVs, smart vacuums, have cameras, microphones, all those kinds of things. And it's an effort to collect data, and then what these companies do is analyze data, and that analysis is generally sold to organizations in industries that want to use that analysis to better sell products or better sell politicians and all those kinds of things. So when we talk about surveillance capitalism, that's kind of the broad understanding of it. And when you understand that broad approach, you recognize that surveillance capitalism shapes the entire globe. And that shouldn't be too shocking. The panel talked about this last week, that the origins of the internet revolution came from the military-industrial complex, and its goal was to basically surveil people at every possible way. Of course, this was a tough sell to get people to put something in their house that listens to them or watches them. This has been the genius of American capitalism. They've made us feel happy. We have a warm relationship with Alexa. We like to talk to Siri, but really these are just kind of happy faces being put on the age-old practice of surveillance. And so, at least in my estimation, that's how I kind of come at surveillance capitalism.
So what you said is very smart and very serious, but all I can think of is that dumb meme of like the 1960s guy who's like, oh, don't say that because the wiretap may hear you. And then in 2020, it's like, hey, wiretap, what's the weather outside? Right? It's like when you're talking to your Alexa phone.
Yeah.
Abby, what about you? I guess, like, you know, again, there's a lot here, but for you, how do the kind of terms surveillance and capitalism really come together in a way that our audience should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think Nolan touched upon a lot of great things. As someone who's an anti-imperialist and who understands that imperialism is really an outgrowth of this unfettered capitalism, you know, it is interesting because it almost seems like it was an inevitability construct of the system that we live in today, where surveillance capitalism has really taken over. You know, when the internet started, yes, even though it was an outgrowth of the military-industrial complex, it still was kind of painted and embraced as this egalitarian mode of communication, of sharing of information. And in fact, that is how it started. And when social media came on the scene, a lot of it was painted as almost revolutionary. I mean, I remember during the Arab Spring, Twitter was being touted as this revolutionary tool that could really jumpstart actual social movements, take down oppressive governments. And I think that what it's turned into today, and especially in the wake of the Edward Snowden revelations, where we know that the NSA is literally collecting everything that we do, and of course working in concert with these giant tech monopolies that have consolidated all of the information that we see, hear, and read. We are commodities. Everything that we ingest on a daily basis is, and all of our thoughts and ideas and the output of information is all commodified and sold. It's almost like a pre-programming Minority Report kind of construct of reality that we've stepped into, where they know what we're thinking before we think it. They know how to sell us products that we don't even know that we need yet. And it's almost to the point where I don't even know what ideas are my own sometimes, or other people's. Like, is this an original thought, or is this something that's been planted from this kind of, construct of information that has been curated for us by these tech overlords? I think, it has so many different layers of effects for society. Not only is there a chilling effect that prevents you from actually speaking openly because of the broader idea that we're constantly being spied on and surveilled and watched, right? When we all read 1984 in school, that was like an outrageous notion, right? That we all had telescreens that we had to carry around with us. And, that's just so far beyond the notion of what reality could be. And here we are, carrying our cell phones with us everywhere we go. And it's just become such a commonplace thing. But beyond this chilling effect, it's just so egregiously destructive to the free flow of information. Because let's just say what's going on in Palestine right now, because it's directly affected me and, of course, my movie. And this is a really, devastating issue that we're seeing unfold right now. And this kind of tech monopolization over information and the algorithmic control and curation of what we see is absolutely, reroutes people into the modes of thought that is basically put out there by whatever the tech monopolies and whatever the censors want us to see. And so I think people have taken that idea that corporate media is untrustworthy, and I think that this new generation that is growing up today understands that as part of our reality, right? Capitalism is unsustainable. Climate change is a serious issue. And I think that they realize at the tail ends of these bloodbaths in Afghanistan and Iraq, like, the corporate media lies to you. The corporate media is untrustworthy. But unfortunately, I think that they've put a lot of their trust, and as we all have, in social media as the answer, because that allegedly is this unfiltered thing, and we can get these direct access to information and directly follow the journalists that we want to see. But as Nolan mentioned, and as, of course, the previous two panels, social media is exactly the same. Corporate media is working hand in glove with social media. And of course, we see basically the rules are the same, that you have to adhere to the orthodoxy of US capitalism and imperialism in order to be seen and heard on these social media networks. And we're seeing increasing algorithmic censorship and control of the issues, massive purges of Palestinian voices, basically anyone that falls out of line with the current agenda and narrative that's put out by corporate media, by US political establishment. We're seeing that increasingly be censored and suppressed. And that is a very, very dangerous future, because people don't actually know, right? And when they search on Google and try to find information, I mean, as we know, the algorithms changed back in 2016 with this broader thing of Russiagate and the fight. It's all under the banner of fighting fake news, which is really ironic. And so we're kind of left struggling, of course, people in alternative media and independent media, to pull back the pieces and pick up the pieces and try to encourage people like, hey, we really need to continue to invest and build into these alternative structures. Otherwise, we're going to completely disappear. And that's exactly the intention. I hope I answered the question.
Oh, and then some. No, I think it was spot on. I mean, like, and just really quick, like one other thing to throw in, since we've mentioned Professor Zuboff a couple times, she points out that like there was also this critical moment in 2001, right, where legislators were talking about privacy in the digital era. And then 9/11 happened, and suddenly it just gave complete excuse for all the most reactionary elements on both the left and the right to say, well, screw it. Like, let's use these digital tools to surveil the shit out of everybody in the sake of national kind of defense, yada, yada, yada. Manar, I want to bring you in here and ask you, kind of building off everything that's going on here, but also, for your own, from your own side, like how does the concept of surveillance capitalism work for you?
Well, as an independent journalist and an anti-war activist, I see surveillance capitalism as the number one issue facing this country and this world, because without the free flow of information being in the hands of we the people, we have basically descended into authoritarianism and fascism, as Abby basically described very, very well, and so did Nolan. Today, we have the deep state, the CIA, the military-industrial complex, partnering up with the Silicon Valley tech giants who have taken complete control of how algorithms work and how information is being shared online through this very attractive means that has kept us very addicted to the very system that is using us as the product, as Nolan described. And so when I think about surveillance capitalism, I think about, for our future generations, how can we truly, truly, truly address climate change? How can we truly address money and politics? Taking the power out of the hands of the elite and the 1% and putting it back into the hands of the people. How can we truly talk about genocide in Gaza, Israeli apartheid, when the very entities that we should be holding accountable are basically in control of all of the information that we have online? When looking back at the last decade of starting Mint Press as an independent media outlet, I started it during the age of like the Huffington Post, when it was possible for independent media to rise above corporate media, when, there were no social media algorithms to stop us, And so in the last decade, and especially since the last, the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, when especially the Democratic Party and Democratic Party talking heads that we see today, they're the ones that led this effort down the road of social media censorship and the control over the free flow of information and how things are shared online. When Hillary Clinton partnered up with all of her Democratic Party talking heads and Democratic Party aligned organizations and think tanks like the Atlantic Council and others, when they came together and banded together, we now saw for the first time in a very long time, literally the military-industrial complex partnering up with these organizations to take control over information and to deplatform independent media outlets. It all started under the guise of fighting fake news. But what ended up happening is that a lot of anti-police brutality pages ended up getting deplatformed. And of course, independent media outlets like Mint Press, like Abby Martin's pages, we started to find that we could barely reach our own audiences. And so what we're seeing today is this rise of information that does not work in the interest of the people. Today, Israel is bombing Gaza. It has raided Al-Aqsa Mosque. It is engaging in major ethnic cleansing in Sheikh Jarrah. And the media and Google search results and Twitter news is all headlining with talking points that are coming straight out of the State Department, straight out of Israel's defense ministry. And it's not truly representing the millions upon millions of social media posts that are coming out of these Palestinian voices that are showing the brutality of Israeli apartheid that is 100% funded by US taxpayer money. These are the kinds of stories and these are the kinds of imagery that should be shown to the American public, yet our mainstream corporate media and these social media tech giants are working hand in hand to ensure that the American public only sees what the military industrial complex allows us to be shown because it suits them and it allows for profits for them. So in my opinion, just to rehash, I do think that surveillance capitalism is the number one issue facing the planet right now, because people are they're not having the proper access to the kind of information that would truly bring back the power into our hands so that we can hold the establishment accountable.
Hell yeah. I thought that was harrowingly and beautifully put. I mean, because in a way, yeah, it's like it's through those circuits of surveillance capitalism, right, that so many of the other issues that consume, like our political concern converge, right? I mean, or those are the circuits through which that power that we are concerned with, whether it be economic power, military power, the power of, companies that are polluting the planet and the military that's polluting the planet, right? Like these run through the circuits of surveillance capitalism that we as human beings were imbricated in those same circuits, right? And I wanted to kind of like synthesize a couple of things because this does really connect quite well to the discussions we've had for the previous 2 live streams, right? And so I want to kind of just to boil it down for viewers because we just put a lot on your plate, right? And I want the full weight of everything that has been said by the panel so far to really set in. But recall, if you will, back in the first panel, right? One of the essential questions that we talked about understanding what the digital age even is, right? Was I think I gave the example of like the Matrix, right? That's the most popular pop culture example that we can think of, right? Where you have virtual reality and then a more real reality somewhere underneath it. And I think that when we started eking our way into the 21st century, that's kind of how we expected the digital realm to be, as almost an augment or a secondary kind of reality beyond the real hard reality that we lived in today. And we also talked about in the panel that that's not the case, right? Our reality is fundamentally intertwined with the two, right? And we saw that this past year in the pandemic, right? Where so much of our lives could only really continue because of the digital technologies that we had access to and that allowed us to connect with people while many of us were languishing in quarantine at home, right? So then add on to that, right? Kind of building off what Manar and Abby and Nolan were just saying, right? In one way, we know where the evil in all of this is, but we only know how to interpret it in like 20th century terms, right? I'm thinking about those famous pictures that like Stalin in the USSR, right, had airbrushed, with certain kind of generals and people next to him. People have all seen the real photo and then the airbrushed photo where the person is gone. And we look at that and we say, like, that's what totalitarianism, that's what it is. It's wiping a person from historical memory. But then if you look at the fact that we depend on the digital technologies that we're talking about in order to know the world, in order to communicate with people, in a way, everything that Abby, Manar, and Nolan were just describing has that same effect, right? You are communicating to the world through social media, and then suddenly someone is airbrushed out of existence, right? Someone's account is deleted, whether you're a hood communist or whether you are, a Palestinian activist, right? Suddenly you are gone from that reality, right? You are out of visibility. And we just don't call that totalitarianism like we would have in the 20th century because I think of what you were saying, Nolan, that we become so dependent on these things that we still do feel like we're in the driver's seat. But we're not. We're very clearly not, right? So I'm going to shut up real quick, and I wanted to bring this discussion back to eye level because it was there. Manar, you talked about why you founded Mint Press. Abby, you talked about your documentary. Nolan, you work with Project Censored. The event that brought us all together for this live stream series was a Project Censored sponsored conference that got completely deleted off YouTube, right? So I wanted to ask if we could go back around the panel and talk about when it was in our personal and maybe even our professional lives that sort of tingling sense that we were not in the driver's seat and that this was in fact, as you say, Manar, the real world historical kind of challenge of the 21st century. In your own experience, when did that start kind of coming to light? I guess we'll go back around with Manar and go clockwise.
There were many instances, but I think, for me, I grew up as an American and lived under Israeli occupation and apartheid, and I witnessed firsthand human rights abuses. And when I came back to the United States as a preteen, I was about 12, 13 years old, that was the first time I really was mature enough to witness what propaganda looked like, because I turned to the mainstream corporate media to keep up to date with what was going on back home. And I saw the media present the narrative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the lens of, religion. And it was very dehumanizing towards Palestinians, always presenting Israel as a beacon of democracy in the Middle East, freedom, and all, freedom of expression, and our, the United States ally in the region. But when Palestinians were presented, they were always shown, covering their faces, armed, angry, always chanting slogans at Israel. The media, the mainstream corporate media, never showed the true image of just regular Palestinians living their daily life, trying to survive under occupation and apartheid. And just a couple of months after that, after we had arrived back to the United States, I witnessed the media beating the drums of war after 9/11, after the 9/11 attacks. And I watched all of corporate media come together and start beating the drums of war to support the US invasion of Afghanistan and then eventually Iraq. And I sat in my classroom as the United States dropped its first bombs on on houses in Afghanistan, and also at the same time in Iraq when that war was launched. And I looked around and there were kids cheering the United States military on. Yeah, we're gonna get those fuckers. Yeah, those sand niggers. I heard all of those terms while I was sitting in class. And the power of propaganda, the power of propaganda was so evident at that time. I was, now 12, 13 years old. It was devastating for myself as this Middle Eastern, American Palestinian girl sitting in this, suburban, all white kids classroom. But I was devastated, but also empowered and also inspired enough, believe it or not, to say that enough is enough and we have to take back our media. And so along those lines, a decade later, I started Mint Press News with this hope that I could build something that was independent of corporate interests, independent of special interests influencing media, so that I could, and the people that I would work with, could give a voice to those living under war and humanize those people and show the true faces of war and show the brutality of the US military machine, because those kids in my class at that time had no idea. They had been propagandized. And so when I had started Mint Press and we had been successful in, covering the US military actions in Iraq, its never-ending, forever war on terror, and the ongoing aggressions against countries in Africa and sanctions wars, that gave me hope. But it was during the 2016 election that really I started to question how successful we can be in sharing this information, because those leading the effort to control the free flow for information, as I mentioned earlier, were the very people that were standing in front of our TV screens, like Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, the woke Democrats that were spreading humanitarianism around the world and human rights. Those were the ones who were advertising for the consolidation of media and the control of media, and for NATO think tanks, Saudi Arabia and Israel, to work with social media giants like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and bringing in the UK government, all of these things to fight so-called fake news. But what ended up happening was I witnessed the purging and deplatforming of thousands and thousands of pages, and activists and people that I know personally who have, that go on Twitter and social media just to call out war crimes, and they've been completely wiped off. And now today, people who question any sort of narrative with, the pandemic or vaccinations, pro-vaccines or anti-vaccines, people are getting bullied. The conversation have become so polarized. And I think that's, that infighting that's taking place with Americans, this, race war and all of this just polarization in conversations where you can't even have a basic discussion anymore online, that's also part of it too. It's all part of the divide and conquer tactic of let's fight, the establishment has us fighting each other while they take more control over our thought and the information that's being shared online. And so that's really where I really became to worry about the free flow of information and how much access people do have, because people are getting censored and suppressed. And even though we still are there on social media, there is no question that we are being suppressed, because in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen our readership decline over 70% since the woke Democrats partnered up with the military machine and social media giants to control what we see and hear on our news feeds.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus, I imagine we've all experienced that to some degree, right? I mean, like, I genuinely feared this every single day. As like, is one kind of decision made thousands of miles away in Silicon Valley going to basically make it impossible for the real news to continue to exist? I don't fucking know, but I mean, like, it sure as hell feels like a possibility. Nolan, I guess what about you? For in your own personal and professional experience, like, when did the kind of creeping reality of surveillance capitalism start to show itself to you?
You have to, I mean, initially I have to really give credit to Edward Snowden. I mean, the releases by Edward Snowden, I had heard different folks talk about this. There had been different discussions of the giant surveillance state. But once Snowden released his files, I sort of naively assumed, like, okay, now we can finally have this discussion and it will be taken seriously. Of course, what I didn't anticipate is it would become a discussion about Edward Snowden, the person, versus Edward Snowden's the documents that he released. But that really stuck with me. I grew concerned with the way social media was regulating the content it sent at users during the 2016 election. That's when I deleted my social media accounts for the most part, was just prior to that election. But I'd say I started to get sort of concerned about the power of big tech right after the 2016 election. I saw these kind of conversations about censoring folks like Alex Jones and who I had, long criticized and written about. But I was concerned about the slippery slope. I've studied history, and so I was well aware that usually the left, whenever a censorship regime takes over, the left usually finds itself on the losing end in the United States. And so I watched as sort of most of the focus was on censoring right-wing content. And then the big kind of scary moment, I think, that I remember actually sending a chill up my spine was when social media companies made the decision to censor the Hunter Biden story just prior to the 2020 election. Personally, I didn't really care about the story so much, but just the idea that they were manipulating with information that could have an influence on an election to that degree right out in the open really kind of, it frightened me in huge ways. And it was shortly thereafter that I found out that they had censored the conference that I helped organize, the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas. And, that was a real wake-up call, that there was so much fixation on talking about right-wing victimhood, that is, right-wingers being victims of censorship, that we missed an opportunity to talk about how it was happening on the left. And we continue to miss that opportunity. More progressive outlets or other independent outlets are censored all the time. And it doesn't really rise to our discourse. And that's kind of back to what Manar said, right, is that we're so polarized in the United States already over largely cultural issues that those on the left side of the spectrum can't admit that there is, right-wing voices being censored, because that would feed into right-wing rhetoric. So as a result, they block themselves from being able to talk about how left-wing voices are also being censored. And social media is built on appealing to polarization, right? The social media content that gets the most attention generally appeals to negative emotions. So it only feeds into our polarization. We lose the ability to recognize that someone we might disagree with on the ideological spectrum can be a victim. We've really lost that sort of sensibility. For those of us who are aware of that the censorship is going on across the ideological spectrum, it creates a chilling effect. Just to give you an idea, a moment ago when Manar was speaking, she used a couple of phrases and epithets to describe what she was hearing. And my first reaction was like, wow, they're probably going to censor this video on YouTube. They're not going to understand the context in which Manar was using those, but that was kind of my first reaction. And that's sort of that chilling effect in real time. So I think, what I would kind of, I guess, to sum up and explain to the audience that this isn't really a left or a right issue. Social media companies and the regimes they work with, including the United States, they tend to censor content that threatens their interests. So if you make a big protest, they may get rid of some content because they see it as a public relations issue. They may censor some content that affects their profit model. We saw this with like the Robinhood app. They may, threaten content that affects their political power. It's not necessarily a left versus right issue. And as long as we keep kind of remaining hyperpolarized, we really can't get to the source or the problem of censorship in the age of surveillance capitalism. So that's at least kind of how my understanding was formed and where it's at.
Abby, what about you? I mean, I'm by all means, feel free to respond to anything that's been put on the table since your last time speaking, but also, I guess just in your personal and professional kind of life, when did kind of the reality of the full weight of this system of surveillance capitalism, how did it impact you or show itself to you?
Well, it's interesting because I'm 36 years old, and so I kind of grew up in this golden age of the internet, what it could be and then what it turned into now, and seeing the dangerous track of where it's going. I woke up to, of course, the larger issue of media censorship. I think the Iraq War solidified that to me. I was wondering, why was the political establishment covering for like war criminals, and why were we bombing this sovereign nation that had nothing to do with 9/11? I learned so much from YouTube. When I was a young adult, I really understood that there was a whole counter narrative to what the corporate media was feeding us. And I was absolutely stunned. And so, I started Media Roots, which is an organization that was inspired by learning, all of these alternative narratives. And at the time, I was able to generate a lot of support for Media Roots because the algorithms were, not designed they were designed to basically favor, everyone. Again, going back to that egalitarian notion of what the internet was projected as being at the very beginning. And social media did help me at the time. Occupy Wall Street sparked off. I was, there covering that. And then, of course, Russia Today found me there. And so going on RT and being able to generate an audience for the kind of news that I was delivering was really amazing. Then came the 2016 election. This was 2 years after my show ended on RT. And then I realized that everything was about to change, right? The DNI report came out that essentially blamed Trump's election on fake news. So going back to what Manar was saying, I mean, all of this was so offensive to liberal sensibilities in this country that they had to blame the rise of alternative media as the reason why someone like Trump could take power, not the fault of, the systemic failures of capitalism or the oligarchy in place, or the Democrats' abysmal failure at just governing and holding true to any of their promises. No, it was actually our fault. It was journalists' fault for providing some sort of alternative narrative to what the corporate media was selling. So how dare we, right? And so, of course, what we saw after that, and I was kind of swept up into this Russiagate hysteria, actually labeled in the DNI report as one of the reasons why Trump actually won, because I was simply talking about things like third parties, talking about things like Occupy Wall Street, and all of these things, of course, quote unquote, towed the Russian line. And what we saw after that was just a complete slippery slope. The algorithms changed. Atlantic Council working with all of these Gulf monarchies and defense contractors, and this black box algorithm that just essentially started purging people, pages, accounts that didn't fall in line with this. And so being like at the center of this and knowing that they were going to use anything that basically just didn't agree with the corporate media line, I was pretty alarmed. And I was really kind of on this tip from the very beginning, because I saw how dangerous that was, to deem anything, insidious Russian propaganda that basically the liberal political establishment and the corporate media at large did not agree with. And we have just seen that just spiral out of control. It's basically, people are defamed as not only just spreading Russian propaganda, but being actual Russian agents for simply talking about these things, like US foreign policy, right? Like criticism of capitalism. So I was swept up into this, but I've also, of course, been affected, as Manar talked about. Once the algorithms changed, all of our websites started being shadow banned, numbers started dropping. And being, of course, a fervent pro-Palestine activist, I mean, I do see primarily, and of course, in conjunction with anti-imperialism, I mean, this is one of the subjects that is, I think, the most obvious in terms of how reality is shaped and how the narrative is controlled. And this is absolutely shocking, and we're seeing, it doesn't matter what Israel does, it doesn't matter how many crimes are committed, it doesn't matter what the reality that we see, the narrative just is very rigid on the corporate media, and it just continues to be just a very one-sided pro-Israel narrative. I totally agree that Twitter, this polarization is such a huge problem, and Twitter has really truncated all of the worst aspects of society and humanity, and it just has us warring with each other all the time. We're isolated into these thought bubbles. We actually don't know how to argue with each other, and really, I mean, that's the platform. I mean, we can't actually have context to our analysis. We can't actually have a foundation to what we're saying. So everything is just picked apart. It's all very superficial, and we all just get trapped in this time suck endlessly arguing with people online. And it's so counterproductive. And I really think that's the design, actually. But, there was this poll recently taken across 54 countries that not only did the citizens of the world say that, of course, the US, not China, not Russia, is the biggest threat to democracy, but they specifically singled out big tech and this notion of surveillance capitalism as the essential primary threat to democratic principles. And I really couldn't agree more with that, because as we, constantly hear and about censorship in places like China, we don't understand how we're censored here, right? Because we think that we live in a free and open society. We think that we have the First Amendment and we're able to practice these things, but we don't understand the insidiousness, the nature of surveillance capitalism, and the way that that construct is applied to manage what we are reading, hearing, and thinking online. I think that a really, really disturbing trend, as Nolan mentioned, is the fact that this has gone so far where they actually removed, actual stories about Hunter Biden, rather. And then you saw the really disturbing thing where not only Trump was removed, because of course that came way after the slippery slope was already in place, that, everyone was basically affected. Trump was kind of the tip of the iceberg on that. But what I find more disturbing are the QAnon accounts. And then, of course, the invariability of having all of these leftists purged as well. The Antifa accounts, anti-police brutality accounts, things like that. Because when you are purging anything that just is talking about something like QAnon, which you could argue is an embrace of an alternate reality, but when you are purging all of those accounts and forcing them into an alternate lane of reality, what does that do? What is that going to do to society? It's just to sanitize like our view, right? They don't want these people online. They just want to purge them completely. But where are they going to go? And what does that mean for the discourse? Because there are millions of people who believe in this, right? There are millions of people who believe in what is called conspiracy theories, many of which have validity and merit. Many do not. But that's up to us to have the discourse, to work through these things with each other, to come to some sort of consensus reality, to apply the tools of critical media literacy so we can understand that we need to have critical thinking. And that's how we sort through quote unquote fake news. So now it has gotten so bad to the point where, like Manar said, if you just simply have disagreements about what's going on with COVID, for example, you literally have been purged from YouTube. People's entire bodies of work are vanished in an instant. And that is just so unsettling, because we have all built up as alternative media people for the last 10, 15 years, these networks, these modes of communication, these platforms, and for them to be ripped out under us, where we have no viability, right? And Patreon's doing the same thing, scarily enough. So we're in a really bad way. And I think we're trying to pick up the pieces and urgently trying to figure out, where do we go from here? How do we build up alternative structures? And what do we do about an oligarchic political establishment that is only continuing to consolidate control, and in conjunction to that, consolidate control of information? And that's a really, really scary future that we have laid out before us, and a big fight ahead of us.
You guys remember that what is it? The Twilight Zone movie where there's the kid who can control stuff with his mind, and everyone in town, if they think about the kid, if they think bad thoughts, then he'll like turn them into like a monster or something. It feels like we're all living in that sort of low grade state of anxiety, right? Like we're all carrying on with our digital lives with this kind of like creeping fear somewhere in the back of our mind that at some point it could all go away like that, right? And yeah, how do you build when you are on foundations that are so precarious, right? How do you build political movements or political consensus, like you were saying, Abby, when the very notion of a public sphere, right, that was supposed to kind of be the public sphere was supposed to kind of be this sort of like crucible of democracy, right? It was the place where different opinions came, people argued, they hashed things out, the better ideas won out, yada yada yada, right? That's the ideal. You don't have that as our panelists all said. Like we do not have that for a number of reasons. Either one, people are being censored or shadow banned or completely, banned entirely from the public sphere as it exists in the digital world. Or we have a whole bunch of little algorithmically enclosed microspheres where, I guess what we call echo chambers, right? Where you are kind of only really seeing what the algorithm wants you to see, because the algorithm is adjusting what you see to what it believes are your kind of preset impulses and prejudices, and those feed off each other, yada, 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 right? Again, I would encourage viewers to go back and look at the other two panels where we kind of flesh some of these ideas out as well. And I wanted to, there's just such a great conversation, and there's so many points that I wanted to pick up on, but I know that we're getting close to the Q&A section with Mickey. And I know that, I think that going into that section, right, one of the real important things for us is to try to at least give audiences watching right now, like some sense of what life and media could be if we were not dominated by the kind of prerogatives of surveillance capitalism that this panel has been laying out so thoroughly, right? Even that question of political polarization, right? Like we were saying, like, that doesn't necessarily have to be the way that social media and everything else is organized, right? But it is the way that it is organized when that system is calibrated to the profit-seeking ends of private corporations. Why? Because the more that we are locked into those echo chambers, the more predictable that we can become, the better consumers that we can be, the more reflective of our consumer habits our data are, so that companies like Facebook and Twitter and so on and so forth can sell it to other companies, right? There are material capitalist like prerogatives that are driving the things that we call polarization, right? The things that we call echo chambers, right? But we just don't, in our political discourse, we rarely ever seem to connect those two, at least in the mainstream media. Everyone here does a brilliant job of doing this kind of thing, right? But I guess I would really stress that for viewers, right? It doesn't have to be that way. There are other ways for this digital reality to exist and for us to participate in it and to use the technologies that we have for different sorts of ends. And so that's kind of where I wanted to round things out. But I guess giving my final word, because Mickey will be the next one to kind of pick this off, one thing really struck me earlier in this conversation. Abby, you said that there was even a point in your life where you weren't entirely sure if your thoughts were your own, right? If they were independently generated, right? That is something that consumes me daily, right? Because I guess my answer to the question of like, when did it become clear to me that I was not in the driver's seat of myself in the digital world, and in fact there were a lot of strings being pulled that I couldn't see, was, I think everyone's had that kind of experience where they're like, man, I was just talking about this thing, and then suddenly I see on my news feed an advertisement for that thing. And like, is my phone listening to me? It has to be, because I haven't typed it in. I haven't done that, yada, 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 right? We've all had some experience like that. I had an experience like that where I stopped in my tracks and I was like, honestly, I don't know if it's that my phone was listening to me talk about this thing, or that I've been so kind of conditioned by the technologies and the algorithms that I use that in fact I thought this was an original discussion that I had. I thought this was original thought that I had, but actually it was anything but. I was really kind of just repeating what the algorithms had kind of conditioned me to repeat, right? And so that's something that we talked about in the very first panel, right? What does freedom mean in the digital era? How can we as human beings express our free agency when so much of our capacity to express that agency is not in our control? It's being boxed in and conditioned and pushed along by these algorithms, by these technologies, by these private corporations. What does it even mean to want freedom when we don't even know how much of ourselves are doing the wanting of it, right? And so with all that in mind and all the brilliant thoughts that our brilliant panelists have kind of shared, I wanted to go back around the table and lead things in to Mickey's Q&A about if we could at least give one or two examples or some sense of what the digital future could be if we were able to wrestle it away from the prerogatives of surveillance capitalism. And so I guess, Abby, why don't we start with you and go counterclockwise?
I mean, I think it could be a beautiful thing, right? Because we all know that these tools are super crucial and can be amazing. I wouldn't say necessarily revolutionary tools, because I think that we shouldn't depend on Twitter or Facebook to start the revolution. Obviously, that needs to go back to peer-to-peer organizing away from digital modes of communication. But I think that they are incredible tools, and they have the potential to be incredible tools. And we need to somehow wrestle that power away. And there has been obviously policies proposed to break up big tech. I think that is absolutely what needs to happen. I am an advocate of actually public ownership of tech companies. That absolutely needs to happen. In my view, these companies are way too huge, monolithic, and out of control. And they're only going to continue to consolidate. We already see how, Facebook now owns Instagram and Google owns YouTube, and how much more are we going to see this constrict and strangle our modes of communication? It's a very scary thought. I think it could be a beautiful thing, though. I mean, going back to how the internet started out, and the fact that so many people were able to generate careers and create this beautiful thing, which is, I think, all of us kind of did that to a certain extent. I mean, that's certainly how I got to where I am today. I was able to kind of utilize the tools that the internet gave me to pursue my passion of journalism. But now I'm worried about future generations not being able to do that because they aren't given the tools to do that. They are constricted. They are prevented from doing that. I think that it's going to take, sadly, going back to what it used to be, which is, I think, subscribing to people's newsletters and trying to figure out how can we follow directly the journalists and people that we want to see thrive and survive in the increasing draconian authoritarian nature of surveillance capitalism. And that means, sadly, as capitalism spirals out of control, to fund and sponsor these types of entities. And that is things like Real News Network, right? Project Censored, things like Empire Files and Mint Press News. They're such crucial entities because we need these alternative modes of information. We absolutely need these, and we need, and unfortunately that means people, peer-to-peer grassroots fundraising and donations to help these organizations survive. And that's really kind of all I can see that we can do right now, because until we actually can sustain and survive as organizations, as truth-telling organizations that do not work for any state, that do not work on behalf of any corporation or advertiser, that is going to actually require people stepping up and realizing that it's going to take all of us to prop each other up. And then we can try to work on building an alternative structure that does not depend on the companies that we know are never going to bend to our will. They're never going to change unless we have some top-down policy doing that, right? And I don't see hope for that, at least in the near future. So that's what I hope the future can bring. I am optimistic largely about where things are going, because I think the mass consciousness and public consciousness is really on fire right now. And I think that people are realizing, especially with the latest assault on Palestine, how lumped in kind of Zionist entities in the Israeli government, are with things like Facebook, things like Twitter. For example, I mean, there are 13 former IDF soldiers working on Facebook's board. Like that's pretty crazy, right? 28 working with Google. God knows how many former US State Department officials or people from think tanks are working in concert with these agencies as well. So this really comes down to us continuing to fight, continuing to spread the word of critical media literacy, and continuing to figure out with each other how to build each other up and construct these alternatives together.
Hell yeah. Again, I was over here doing that. So Nolan, what about you?
I think I'll pick up on a lot of the stuff that Abby said, which is brilliant as always. I think in a post-surveillance capitalist world, we should approach it with the idea that Americans always watch so much media, and we get made fun of like internationally because our media always has like happy endings. Democracy doesn't have a happy ending. It's more like the soap opera that goes on forever. These are issues we always have to deal with. We always have to stay on top of. Democracy is a 24-hour day job. If you're not interested in always keeping on top of these issues, there's a lot of authoritarian regimes that would like to draft you. So I think being on top of these issues would be one way to get there. What that society would look like, I want to make it clear, and I think this has sort of been said in a bunch of the comments. We haven't said it directly. The tools themselves are not necessarily bad or necessarily against democracy. It's the ways in which we've allowed them to be shaped and introduced to the public, i.e. it's the way that these companies have designed the platforms on these tools. So I'm not a protectionist that thinks we need to like just cut out all media from our entire diet, right? That's kind of the narrative of The Social Dilemma, which is one of the reasons I don't like that documentary. The other reason is it has a bunch of like tech bro thieves who are now asking for an apology after they've absconded with all the wealth. But this more using these tools would mean designing the tools in a way that actually serves our society. So, disentangle ourselves from the big tech notion that social media is social. Instead, let's make social media actually social. What would it mean if it was social? What would it mean if we had reciprocity and the opportunity to collaborate and spaces of privacy and things like that? The post-surveillance capitalist world would also cut out a lot of the chilling effect in media, which not only affects the issues that citizens are willing to talk about, but also it would allow journalists to do a lot more work. Journalists already have tons of hoops to jump through to get sources and get stories out there. But now trying to hide their digital record, which might threaten their sources or stories, is another hurdle that surveillance capitalism has created for them. And so I see the post surveillance capitalist world. I guess I would say that anything is possible with these tools. We shouldn't hold ourselves to the limited understanding that big tech has allowed us. The sky can be the limit. And I think some of those things that Abby talked about, in particular about public ownership, is really important. And it's worth reminding people that it was public tax dollars that were responsible for the advent of the internet and most of the features of the Apple iPhone. Elon Musk and Tesla had government loans. Now, of course, Elon Musk doesn't want to pay taxes. So reminding these folks that these are public goods that we paid for, and thus we, the people, have a right to design and use them in a way that serves our society. To me, that's what a post-surveillance capitalist media environment would look like.
You saying seize the means, my man? Hell yeah.
Absolutely.
Manar,
Nolan's
what about
on
you?
board.
Nolan's on board.
Well, I think that the ideals of a true democracy and the ideals of our Constitution and our amendment rights, like our First Amendment and the right to privacy, the right to free speech, the right to have an opinion and have like a basic conversation and debate. Those are the kinds of things that would tap in, that would be upheld in a society without surveillance capitalism. You know, at one point, I believed those were the ideals that this country was founded upon, maybe when I was a lot younger and more naive. But those are the ideals that I truly believed. And, you know, as an independent journalist, those are the ideals, believe it or not, for most people that are watching, that's what we're trying to protect as independent journalists. You know, when we go out and hold our elected officials accountable, when we call out the war crimes that are being that are taking place at the hands of the military industrial complex, when we are there providing endless coverage of the police state, of the billionaire class, of the 1%, of the consolidation of information and media and all of these things and the monopolies, that's what we're trying to do. We as independent journalists are the ones that are doing the job that our media should be doing. We are the ones who are what I like to call we're the essential workers of the democracy, of our First Amendment. We are the ones who are at the forefront fighting for our First Amendment rights, our Constitution, and for the ideals of democracy. And that's why surveillance capitalism, part of the reason why it exists is to bring down and censor us, the ones that are fighting, the resistance, the dissidents. And that's why people like Julian Assange have been targeted. That's why people like Edward Snowden has been targeted. And that's why independent journalists have been targeted in this suppression campaign. And so if we were truly to believe in those ideals of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, the right to privacy, all of those things, then we would be defending independent journalists and the voices like independent journalists within our circle. And I just want to mention too, just as a Muslim and as a Palestinian and as an anti-war activist, the idea of surveillance has hit very close home to me personally, because after 9/11, Muslims before the Edward Snowden revelations came out, Muslims kind of already knew that we were being surveilled. We knew that we were being surveilled after 9/11. And it was true. Under the Patriot Act, we were being surveilled. And so all of these policies of surveillance of not just Muslims, but activist voices and any dissenting voices, whether it's anti-police brutality activists or anti-war activists, or activists that come out and protest against big pharma and the monopolization of whatever industry there is, or indigenous climate activists. These are the people that surveillance capitalism wants to silence and wants to, like Abby described, completely disappear off of the face of the map of the internet. And a lot of them have. It really begs the question why, the media upholds people like Greta Thunberg, I can't pronounce her last name, which was a great activist. She's doing an incredible job. But in part of the climate change activism movement, not once is the term, the US military, or not the term, but the idea that the US military is the largest polluter in the world is mentioned. Whereas indigenous activists in Colombia or in the Amazon rainforest are literally massacred every single day. And those are the voices that are being completely censored off of social media. Child activists that are standing up to climate change. Same thing when it comes to, I like to use the term woke Democrats, woke progressives, woke liberals. It's like my thing this week. But like the woke liberals, like AOC, she's constantly and regularly put up on this platform, provided a voice when she can barely call out Israeli apartheid and occupation. Whereas people like Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar are regularly targeted in smear campaigns and censorship campaigns when they call out, Israeli apartheid and occupation and war crimes. And so there's a reason why this system exists. It's to give us this illusion that we live in a free society, this illusion that we live in a society that upholds these these values, but it's the complete opposite. And so if we were to tear down that system, we would possibly see ourselves living in a society that truly does uphold our First Amendment and our amendment rights and the values that they uphold. I'm fasting, by the way. I'm having a brain freeze here.
Well, what an incredible panel thus far. Thanks so much, Maximilian Alvarez, Editor-in-Chief, The Real News Network, for hosting us in this series, the Long Sili-CON, as it were, on power and censorship in the digital era. We've had an amazing series so far. This is the third and final part of the series. And thank you all for joining us on YouTube. Over 100 of you have been watching with us live. I want to thank right now and also simultaneously remind those of you that may have tuned in late, we are joined by an incredible group of journalists, scholars, activists, Abby Martin, The Empire Files and Media Roots, also Manar Mahawish-Adley from Mint Press News and Behind the Headlines, as well as media scholar and author Nolan Higdon, who works with us at Project Censored, also one of the main forces behind the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas, and Nolan, one of the organizers behind the scenes with us here for this Real News Network Project Censored collaboration. So you can certainly learn more online at the Real News website, and that's going on in the chat right now with the Real News Network. Also, you can learn more about what we do at Project Censored at projectcensored.org. So many things to pick up upon in the really amazing conversation that's been happening. So many important points. And Abby Martin, I wanted to start with this riff. There's several things we want to do here in the time we have left, 20 minutes. I'm told we're allowed to go a little over if we want to, but I also want to be very mindful of our panelists. Brevity is not one of my strong points, and I know it's not many of yours, despite Manar's recent statement. So nevertheless, one of the threads going on in the YouTube chat, or the sandbox, as I'll call it, is talking about capitalism and definitions of capitalism. And this came up last week when we were talking about, well, what exactly is democracy? And look, this isn't to be coy. But most modern interpretations of what capitalism has morphed into with the merging of state power coming out of the Industrial Revolution, right, as Mussolini said, fascism would aptly be more called corporatism. And of course, corporatism is basically sort of the institutional front of capitalist ideologies. Abby Martin, your program, The Empire Files, looks at the innate connection between imperialism, oppression, and capitalist economies. I mean, Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated Marines in U.S. history in 1935, wrote, "War is a racket." He wrote that he, for 33 years, invading countries in South America and Central America, he wasn't liberating anybody. He wasn't, making life better for people in those places. He himself called himself a gangster for capitalism, which implies brute force to open markets to the U.S., to certain companies, to suppress populations. Whether you go back to the Monroe Doctrine, or you go to Manifest Destiny, or you go to the Roosevelt Corollary, you got Smedley Butler. The whole Cold War is basically a massive resource war. We see the same thing in Afghanistan post 9/11. They had nothing to do with 9/11, but there's $1 trillion of resources there, oil reserves. And Abby Martin, this is a hallmark of your show, looking at the Empire Files, the connection of corporate capitalism and empire, and the need for surveillance and control. So I'm going to spin this around in a little while, the solutions, why we need a truly independent press. But Abby Martin, I'd like if you could riff on some of those themes behind your show. And of course, I want all of our panelists to freely be mindful of what is happening right now in Palestine, what's been happening there for decades, and how this brute force has been used to mobilize against anybody, like in the BDS movement, who has tried to be a voice to stop the imperialist, corporatist oppression of these kinds of peoples. So Abby Martin, kind of big and open, but I know that you can take that and run with it.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that we wanted to construct the show around the notion of US empire is because I truly believe that this is kind of the unspoken necessary worldview that people need to have when you're looking not only at international issues, but when you're looking at domestic issues as well. Because every cent is squandered on this massive military machine that oppresses and subjugates tens of millions of people around the world under the boot of US empire and US imperialism. I do think that imperialism is an outgrowth of capitalism. You said it very well yourself. I mean, these wars are waged to essentially open new markets and extract wealth from countries. There are no poor countries. There are rich countries that have had all their wealth robbed from them. Looking at Africa today, just under the guise of fighting terrorism and counterterrorism, we are propping up brutal regimes, giving Uganda, for example, billions of dollars a year. Meanwhile, talking about, just it's all under the guise of fighting terrorism. And it's just really, really disturbing because if you look at the actual targets of US empire, like you said, Afghanistan, trillions of dollars of mineral wealth, black market opium production. You look at something like Venezuela, which is under the crosshairs of US empire, of course, the largest oil reserves in the world. Look at Iran, another giant oil state. You had Kamala Harris recently giving a talk in Oakland where she actually said, wars were waged over oil for so long, soon they will be waged over water. And I think that's really a disturbing insight into the minds of the imperial heads of state of, talking about where is this world going to go as climate change continues to exacerbate pretty disturbing stuff that you have the leaders at the head of US empire at the helm talking about how, this is going to be a resource that's going to be pretty sacred soon and wars will soon be waged over it. But it is just cartoonish. I mean, it's cartoonishly hypocritical when you look at who is deemed a US enemy and who is deemed a US ally, and just the outlandish notion that it's somehow based on human rights and democracy is just offensively wrong and just so obviously so. And it's just totally absurd that the corporate media continues to parrot this notion and run cover for the US empire as it continues its criminal endeavors around the world, whether it be Yemen, where millions of people are on the brink of starvation, whether it be Palestine subsidizing this apartheid state. It's just beyond the pale, Mickey. And I want to bring it back to Gaza Fight for Freedom really quickly, because this movie, we made this movie, and it really speaks to the notion of surveillance capitalism, because we see that this is a tool that's deployed by the state to control the narrative worldwide in order to enact these regime change operations, in order to brainwash everyone to think that, to basically condition us to be in this perpetual state of war, this continued erosion of our civil liberties. And the notion of privacy is just so far gone. And we're just constantly, year after year, we're conditioned to just think this is normal, right? And it's not. And we can go back to what it was like before 9/11. But the surveillance capitalism has affected me in the sense that, I made this movie Gaza Fights for Freedom a couple of years ago during the Great March of Return in Gaza, where people are, of course, fighting their barbaric oppression at the hands of their colonizers. And we had no choice but to release it ourselves, because all of these, Netflix and Amazon and, of course, all the corporate media, they do not allow the truth about Palestine to be put out there. This is the third rail issue in American journalism. And so I had to release it by myself. We were in debt from the film for a long time. And that's why we had it behind a paywall. But we finally put it up. Immediately was censored by YouTube. They slapped not only an age restriction, but several additional layers of security, where you actually have to not only prove your age, you have to prove who you are, type in identification, credit cards. People are telling me they have never seen this before with any YouTube video they've tried to watch. The search results were suppressed. And I wouldn't be surprised if it were taken down inevitably altogether. But I think it just really speaks to also, this notion of cancel culture and free speech is the sacred thing that's held up. And somehow it's become a partisan issue where conservatives are fighting, under the banner of free speech. When really, if you look at actually censorship in its truest form, I mean, this is what anti-BDS laws are. In 30 states or so across the country, the black hand of the state has censored and imposed actual legislation to prevent us from practicing our free speech, from forcing Americans to forfeit their constitutional rights in order to work in these states. And this is just such an alarming trend. No one's really talking about this. And it just all fits together with the construct of US empire, how it portrays itself through the media apparatus and through the propaganda deployed on American citizens. And going back to the poll that I said earlier about the rest of the world, they get it. They see us as the biggest threat, but Americans are just still in the dark, which leads me back to, again, I can't stress enough for our viewers to support and fund the networks that are really on the right side of history, telling the truth, because that's how we build public consciousness and a movement that can really hold the powers that be accountable.
Well put, Abby Martin. And let's remember Victor Pickard, the media scholar, his book, Democracy Without Journalism, calling for a robustly funded public media system, right? One that is not controlled by the private or corporate for-profit sector, one that is not intertwined with Silicon Valley, one that is beholden to the public interest, not the shareholders. Very important to call out. And of course, Abby Martin, you were also at the receiving end of such censorship involving a critical media literacy conference and BDS laws. It was a top censored story in last year's Project Censored book. So you're certainly no stranger to these issues, certainly not Manar either. And we're going to come to Manar momentarily. But Nolan Higdon, we wanted to take that same trajectory with you. And given that, you and I penned United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation and Post-Truth America and what we can do about it, a big part of what we unpacked was the role of neoliberal policies to sort of steamroll and put different faces on these imperial capitalist policies, create the illusions of discussion and free speech and a free press, while winnowing the public discussion ever more. And of course, all of you have pointed that out in various ways here today. But Nolan, we're really dealing in many ways with the conundrum of the post-truth phenomenon, the hyper-partisan filter bubbles. If it feels right to me, it must be right. I'm right, you're wrong, no matter what. We've really lost any kind of compass that looks for facts and evidence. And you highlight this brilliantly in your book, The Anatomy of Fake News. So I want to hand off this open, question to you about the bigger, broader implications of capitalism and imperialism and how they've related to our media culture and how they've really contributed to our lack of ability, to communicate with each other effectively. Nolan Higdon.
It's a really good question. We detail in the book, and I think it's important for listeners to understand that the news media system, as you see it today, is not traditionally how news media has been in this country. For a long time, most cities in America had, at least two local news outlets. People were generally fixated on local news. There was a litany of national news outlets that were competing against one another, but that all changed in the 1980s and 90s with the consolidation, and we had less and less companies owning more and more of our news media. And as a result, just a handful of corporations control news media, and they are there to make money. So they've cut overseas bureaus, they've cut small markets, they've cut a lot of weekend reporters, and they replaced journalism with, sensationalistic fodder, whether it be like op-ed pieces or takedowns of Twitter feeds, all this kind of minutia. And that's what passes for news in this country. So earlier, we were rightly discussing Palestine. And it's really tough in this country to have a conversation about Palestine or the history of Israel or the history of relations in the region, because there's such a historical vacuum for decades that you almost have to give people an entire history course to catch them up on what's going on before you can talk about what's happening today, while simultaneously disentangling a lot of the corporate news media narratives, which misrepresent the situation. So that's kind of was the problem with news media in general. This was complicated by the advent of social media, which essentially was predicated on the idea that users need to be on their screen giving us data. And the way you keep users on their screen is by confirming the positions they already hold. And so we end up in these echo chambers or digital caves where we're constantly being reinforced in our view, which often includes a caricature of the quote unquote other side. And there's some recent polling out that some the majority of Americans think that the number one threat to their way of life is other Americans. And I think you can make a direct connection between social media and that we actually fear each other. And if you have a society that fears each other, it makes democracy really difficult because it's not like your candidate just lost. It's that your way of life is now going to be destroyed. And when you think in those terms, it makes respect for democratic outcomes very difficult. And I think you've seen this in recent elections. We rightly sort of focus on Trump's dangerous rhetoric about the so-called stop the steal. But Trump wasn't the first one to kind of undermine the idea of these national elections recklessly. I mean, you can go back to the Democratic Party's discourses on Russiagate, or the Republican Party's use of birtherism, and rightly the critique of the 2000 election from Democrats. You can even go back to the 1990s, the way they always tried to undermine Clinton's election. So there's been a long history of kind of partisanship undermining our elections, and that's been fueled by our media system. And social media has just sort of amplified or exaggerated those problems. On the one hand, obviously, it's problematic because we have a false sense of what's actually going on in our country. We have a limited understanding of the issues that do get reported. But I would argue even worse than that, we've lost the ability to even have discussions about things. We don't know how to listen. We're always on all the time. And as a result, we're always trying to post the right thing, virtue signal the right message, call out the right person. We rarely stop to reflect and look at what evidence we have to support our position or what evidence the other side or other person may have to support their position. And so that's kind of what I describe in the book, is we need to get back to a sense of appreciating truth, analyzing content to find out what does and doesn't have evidence, and have some humility. Maybe our quote unquote side is not always right. You can have a nuanced view of things. You can take one position and hold another position that is against your party, and that's okay. And we should also recognize that parties are vehicles to get policies accomplished. They are not. They're not like vehicles to worship celebrities, right? So you shouldn't wear MAGA hats and love Donald Trump. You shouldn't have "I'm with her" bumper stickers. You should elect people in office that you hope to agitate and annoy to get to do what you want. You don't need to defend them. You need to scare them into passing the policies you want. And so that's kind of how I see the intersection of where we're at in our politics, thanks to the changes in our news media.
All good points. And again, Nolan Higdon, co-author with me of United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation, and Post-Truth America, and What We Can Do About It, a whole chapter called Make America Think Again, implying, I don't know, maybe we used to. And of course, most recently, The Anatomy of Fake News, a stellar book that people should be reading, a whole chapter on fake news detection kit, on media literacy. Manar Mahawish Adley, to you, similar riff from Abby through Nolan. If you don't like what's happening in media, be the media. You and Abby certainly have embodied that ethos. And Manar, I want to bring all of these topics to a head with you on Palestine, because I know that is an issue not only near and dear to you personally, but you've done, along with Abby Martin, some of the best journalism around that topic. And it is because of imperialism and capitalism and global hegemony that the Palestinians are living in an open-air prison. And we really need to have accurate media and an open, independent media to help platform those stories, so that people understand more deeply what's happening, particularly with U.S. taxpayer dollars. Israel, to the tune of $6 billion, the main recipient of foreign aid. Back to the concept of post-truth. Any criticism of Israel is automatically considered anti-Semitism, which is nonsense on one hand. And on the other hand, it's dangerous because there are real anti-Semites in the world. And there's a big difference between racists and anti-Semites and people critical of U.S. hegemony in the Middle East through Israel as a proxy state, or Saudi Arabia for that matter. So Manar, I wanted you to pick up this conversation where Abby and Nolan had left off, and then we're going to do one more round on some solutions and the importance of independent media. So Manar, to you, please.
Well, first, I just want to say that it is Ramadan, the last day of Ramadan, so I actually have to go in about 5 minutes for our final iftar. So I probably won't be able to join the talk about the solutions. But, something that I find as someone who has been covering these issues, for the last decade, if not more, as an anti-war activist and as an independent journalist, covering U.S. war crimes and covering, just the military-industrial complexes raining down of bombs and spreading bloodshed around the world, I personally reached burnout a couple of years ago. And I found it really, really exhausting to be on social media. And having lived through apartheid and having witnessed those war crimes and having been online constantly sharing these stories and building up Mint Press, I became completely burnt out and I wasn't even able to express myself anymore in a healthy manner. And so the reason I'm mentioning this is because a lot of times when we talk about solutions, we talk about alternative social media platforms. And we talk about protesting, we talk about contacting our elected officials, but what we rarely talk about is taking care of ourselves and meeting our neighbors. And the reason why this is so important is that a lot of activists have so much anxiety and a lot of independent journalists have so much anxiety that has been driven from covering these issues for such a long time that we only see the world through this lens of imperialism and surveillance capitalism, which is good because we're the real woke people, right? We're the ones who actually see the world for what it is. But what this does is that when we are out in public spaces, we forget to meet our neighbors and talk to them and bring people together into these conversations and have them relate to these issues. And so something that I've personally been doing in talking about Israel and Palestine is not just posting online, but actually getting to know my neighbors and people within our communities, always starting local, getting to the churches, the synagogues, and local events and just introducing myself. A lot of times, especially as a Muslim woman wearing the hijab, sometimes that, people can be intimidated by that. And I use that as an opportunity to get to know people and to show the true face of what it is to be a Palestinian American and as a Muslim woman. And through my kindness and through just, my compassion, talking to people and getting to know people, smiling and laughing, I can bring in people who normally would not care about Palestine or Israel and bring them into the conversation. I think this is so, so important. This is something that I have been really leading the way in my community here in Minneapolis. One of my first jobs as a journalist was working in St. Cloud, Minnesota, which is a super, super right-wing community. It's a state that actually had, I believe, the mayor at one point try to ban the hijab for people in that city. And to also ban women from wearing the hijab in their driver's license picture. It also is home to a lot of white supremacist communities, literal white supremacists. And also it is one of the cities in the district that Michelle Bachmann, if everybody remembers Michelle Bachmann, she used to work in that, represent that district, just to show just how conservative it is. And a lot of people there had never met a Muslim before. They had never met a Palestinian before. What they knew about people over there, what they used to tell me, is that people are just killing each other. It's sectarian. It's all the things that our media shows constantly, that people in the Middle East are barbaric, that they're soulless, that they're backwards. And so what I did was go and talk to these people face to face, hug them, embrace them. A lot of them were white supremacists, and I got onto their level of thinking. And we talked and we embraced each other, and I learned about them and they learned about me in such a compassionate way that we started to understand each other. So my point is that while these social media tech giants give us this illusion that we can only communicate online. And that's why people are just glued. They're glued to their screens. They think that they can make all these friends online. They can talk to people, and they think they're so connected. That's what social media does. It gives us the illusion that we're so connected with people all around the world and we're so informed. It's an illusion. The real connections are the ones that we make in person. Those are the real connections. When we meet people and embrace, and those endorphins are released and we can connect with people. And we are reminded when we do that, that the real enemy is not we the people. It's not us. It's not brown people overseas. It's the people at the very top. A lot of these people that don't like Muslims, or that think people overseas are barbaric, or that support war, they have a lot of trust issues. They're frustrated with the economy. At the end of the day, that's what they really are frustrated about. And they are just filled with so much fear, and they just have like basically built this bubble around themselves, and they're just afraid. But if we can just step out off of online, that's so powerful. It's so powerful to get out and just talk to people and hug them and relate to them and share our personal stories. And I will tell you all, and for everybody who's listening, I have gotten hundreds of people. I know maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but for me, that's a lot. If you can change the mind of one person, the heart of one person, that's all that matters, because we are basically igniting a little flame of love, of hope, that will eventually lead to a big wave of change. And if we can make those little differences, if we can just make those small impacts, eventually, maybe not right now, but eventually that will create a wave of change, and that revolution will continue. And that's why it's so important that we get off of social media. We cut our addiction. Hey, I was addicted too, like I described, and constantly posting about, war crimes and so forth. But what ended up happening is that I myself and a lot of us end up creating an echo chamber. I'm trying to share these things with the world, but in fact, I'm just sharing this information with people who agree with me. And so we have to step out of the social media sphere and get into reality and meet people and hug them and talk to them and make these connections. I think that's so, so important. And I just wanted to end with that as my last words while fasting.
Manar Mahawish Adlai, so well put, and such a fantastic segue into our last few moments together. Brilliantly put, and importantly, empathetic. And this is something that does not get addressed often enough. And we are not reminded of these things while we're glued to these gadgets. Right. And so the last thing I want to get to, and Manar, if you have to go, we totally understand and respect that.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It was an honor to be speaking with all of you. Such an honor. Have a good day.
Much appreciation. That was Manar Mahawish Adlai of mintpressnews.com and Behind the Headlines. Thank you so much, Manar. Last, we're going to wrap up here, but we wouldn't be able to finish unless we came full circle back to media, independent media, journalism, critical media literacy education, the antidote to our solutions. We don't need blacklists. We don't need censorship. We don't need overt control. We really need to have truly independent systems of information. Brief final remarks. I'm reminded in Project Censored this past year, we featured the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. And the Society for Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, going back to 1926, has 4 major provisions. One is that we should seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable and transparent. And at Project Censored, we do that through our curriculum, our education, the Validated Independent News Program with Andy Lee Roth, Steve Masick, some 20 campuses across the country, several hundred students each year. But Abby Martin, I would like to hear your final remarks on the importance of independent media, the importance of a free press moving forward, and how all of us that meet in that public sphere, how do we work together to get beyond the corrals of what is provided by surveillance capitalism?
I'm going to make this short. I was inspired by Project Censored when I was a young adult. It inspired me to generate my own media content, and I haven't looked back since. I think that, as you mentioned, Mickey, the solution is not more censorship. The solution is not black box algorithms that are curating our reality and purging the offensive voices to sanitize, our screens. It is conversations. It is critical thinking skills. I mean, we are so propagandized from birth, and we are so conditioned to think a certain way, and we have this tunnel vision, and it really is taking ourselves out of our comfort zones and really just asking the hard questions to ourselves. How are we getting our news? Who is behind the news? Who is this news serving? Are we really understanding the perspective of the voices that we're not hearing delivered through the narratives through these modes of information? So there's so many different things, and it is work. It is work, and that's why you can go to organizations like Project Censored, Real News Network, Empire Files, and Mint Press News to get the views that you won't hear elsewhere. And people are working full time to provide those alternative narratives for you, to parse through the truth and put that together for you, because it is a full-time job. We don't really understand how pervasive corporate media censorship is. We don't really understand how pervasive the social media surveillance capitalism is, with our daily lives. And so it's up to organizations like that to help guide people through how to navigate the spectrum, this wide spectrum of propaganda that's just being peddled at us 24/7. And it's an amazing thing. It's a beautiful thing. As Manar said, I mean, we are the woke ones, right? We are the ones who have the they live glasses on, and we can see the world for what it is. And a lot of people are scared of that. A lot of people don't have the time to do these things, and they don't have the resources to do these things, right? They're working to survive. I mean, half of this country is working paycheck to paycheck and doesn't even have enough money in their bank account to have a future planned. And so that's why you need to go to outlets like this and trust that, again, we are not working on behalf of any corporation or state. We are working for the people, from people just like you, trying to parse through this information, deliver what we feel is most important that is being left out of the dialogue. Critical media literacy is the most essential tool that we have, and we have to teach ourselves and teach each other, because we sure as hell are not getting it from our education curriculum. And that's, again, direct support and endorsement for organizations doing the hard work. And I can't thank Project Censored enough for guiding me throughout my life and my career to understand how important that really is.
Well, Abby Martin,
I guess I didn't make it short.
Well, as I said earlier, brevity is not a strong point of mine, and I suspect none of us have that going on. But you always have so much to say, and I know there will be more. Please check out the EmpireFiles.tv, Media Roots, the work of Abby Martin. Also wrote the foreword to Censored 2019. You can check that out at projectcensored.org. Nolan Higdon, to you. Making America think again was one of our goals in United States, a distraction. The great pedagogy scholar Henry Giroux said, in the end, there's no democracy without informed citizens, well-informed, accurately informed, not in a post-truth way, but in a rational, logical way. And that we also have to, as we're writing in another book, it's important for us to learn how to agree to disagree. It's important for us to learn how to have these difficult conversations. But Nolan, you've got so many fantastic things that you use as tools to teach with. Take us out here with some of the great ideas that you work with students in class every semester, everything from your fake detection toolkit to what we called the 5 C's on critical media literacy, critical education, cultural competency. End us out here on the high note about what we can and are doing about the challenges we face. Nolan Higdon.
Yeah, I'm going to try and make this brief as well, but it seems to me that it covers kind of 2 areas. One is about verifying information, and another one's about sort of how can we kind of mitigate the influence of surveillance capitalism on our lives. So when it comes to verifying news and information, I think we need to reconceptualize how we think about news. News exists to inform us to make better decisions in our democracy. It's not something to share online without any sort of thought. It's not an opportunity to virtue signal. So you really want to investigate the news content you share and believe, and that takes time. So you really want to emphasize quality over quantity, spend more time with less content, and avoid this sensibility of following news outlets. Instead, follow journalists who do good work. Not because she is on the panel, but I always recommend Abby Martin at my talks because there's so little discourse on overseas, the United States empire and imperialism. Abby's one of the few voices out there, and she actually goes to these places and interviews people on the ground, where in corporate news media, they ignore most of the globe. And if they do have to cover it, they usually go to like the embassy and talk to a communications team. So follow brave journalists like Abby Martin. I like some of the work Matt Taibbi's done, of course, love Benar Manhawish and Min Press, etc. And I would encourage, us as citizens of a democracy to expand our ideological spectrum. If you're a liberal, don't be afraid to read conservative news outlets. It's not going to destroy you. You can analyze it and see what evidence they have, so you at least understand where folks are coming from, and it may help you be able to have more constructive dialogue with them. Be really weary of whenever you come across content that confirms your view. As we've talked about, surveillance capitalism is really good at giving you stuff that confirms your view. So be hyper skeptical of that content. Look for what evidence it has, its bias, its slant. So those are some of the ways I think we can mitigate the influence of false information. We can never eliminate it. We can only kind of mitigate its influence. But the other side of this panel, I think, talked a lot about surveillance capitalism in the way it affects us globally. And we talked about these macro solutions of breaking up big tech and public ownership and a more robust education system. But there's also a lot we can do at the micro level. I think back to what Manar said about how if we make small changes, collectively those small changes can be transformative. And so, one of the things I encourage folks to do is reframe the power dynamics with your tools. Right now, it's way too easy for your to use your phone to take pictures or to get notifications. So they have the power over you. Turn the notifications off, turn the camera off, turn the GPS off, and only turn it on when you want to use it. It creates extra steps to using these things, and it mitigates the surveillance. So in that way, you really only use it if you need it, and you're not leaving it surveilling you the whole time. I also encourage you to look at every tool or platform you use and do a cost-benefit analysis. It's too easy to say like all the benefits or all the negative aspects of these tools. Put them side by side and then determine, do you think it's still worth it to use them? Are the costs worth the benefits in that respect? And then lastly, I would sort of say when you're looking at these tools, look at these tools as an opportunity to strengthen democracy. So how could you actually use them to affect policy, to affect change in who is your representative? What are the local policies in your community? Avoid wasting your time on like virtue signaling or online flame wars. How can we actually use these tools to strengthen democracy? That means kind of being a lot more kind of proactive in our approach and in thinking about how we use them. And I think if we start to take these steps, we can avoid the pitfalls of misinformation, and we can also put ourselves in a better position to further the ends of our democracy.
Nolan Higdon, I want to thank you so much for ending us on a high note. As you and I wrote in United States of Distraction, a better future is possible. To help change direction toward a more just and robust civil society, we need to build a non-commercial public media system and increase media literacy and critical pedagogy in schools. Doing so will help us better arm ourselves with the power that knowledge gives and enable us to live with greater deliberation, democracy, and dignity. Nolan Higdon, thank you so much. And thank you, Manar Manhawish Adlai. To learn more about the work we do at Project Censored, go to projectcensored.org. And with that, I hand this back over to the one and only editor-in-chief of the Real News Network, Max Alvarez. Max, thanks so much for everything. Back to you.
Thank you, Mickey. And so ends our 3-part live stream series, co-produced by the Real News Network and Project Censored. But I hope that anyone who has watched these live streams, this one or any of the previous two, recognizes that the conversation itself is very much not over, right? I mean, if anything, we hope that we have left you with more questions than answers, but also we hope that we have provided some sort of direction for the kinds of questions we should be asking of our digital world and the kind of answers that we should be demanding from it as well. And I know that we're running a kind of a little long on this, but I mean, hopefully viewers will understand, because it was such a great conversation and we wanted to get all of these points in. But I don't want to keep our amazing staff and everyone on this panel on for much longer. So I'll wrap up with just a quick final thought, right? There's something that Nolan said earlier in the panel discussion, where he said that you could see the seeds of what digital media could be for us and what they could do for us, right? If they weren't just so dominated by the prerogatives of surveillance capitalism, right? And I think that's what keeps us coming back in a lot of ways, is that promise that we know is there and that we know we could tease out, but that is so often just captured by those circuits of capitalism and control and censorship that we've been discussing over the course of this series, right? But that's what I want to underline as we talk about these kind of points of independent media, right? Is we're trying to underline where those seeds are and show you how they could grow, right? So just to give 3 quick examples, right? I do think that media, social media, has a really kind of important potential, a democratic potential that we're actually seeing unfold right now, right? The 2 examples I would give is, like, we saw the corporate media in the United States quickly circled the wagons and tried to stuff this business class narrative down our collective throats that after the pandemic, no one wants to work anymore, right? No one wants to risk their lives for shit wages when only like 40-something% of the adult population has been fully vaccinated, right? Or the total US population. So we saw the mainstream media kind of push this narrative that no one wants to work anymore. No one wants to take these jobs. Everyone has just been kind of, living off of unemployment benefits. But what we also saw was a really quick bottom-up pushback against that narrative from workers, right? From organizers, from so many people on social media who were posting their stories and pushing against that top-down narrative that for most of my lifetime has just always been pushed down our throats, and we had very little that we could ever do about it. And so seeing people push against that to the point where actually the mainstream media and the business class is kind of retreating a little bit. They've realized that we're not just going to accept this narrative. There's something in that we need to tease out and rescue from kind of the digital landscape today. In the same way, we talked a lot about the, genocidal apartheid violence that is being wreaked upon Palestinians right now. We have seen, again, that consent manufacturing machine snap into action. We've seen headlines kind of really, giving us a very skewed version of what is happening over there and what the context is, what the history is. But again, like the no one wants to work phenomenon, we also saw this worldwide bottom-up push against that kind of hegemonic narrative, right? And that therein lies, I think, the germ, the seed of what we sense is kind of the potential of these technologies, if only they weren't so kind of designed around the profit-seeking motives of private companies that want to surveil and exploit us. In the same way, Manar's final thoughts, about building solidarity with our fellow human beings and doing so from a place of love and doing so not only in online spaces, right, is something that I, cherish very much. And I thank her so much for saying that. And it's something that has really guided my own career in media, right? For years, I've been using the digital technologies available to me, like a microphone, a computer, an internet connection, to interview working people for my podcast, Working People, which is now partnered with The Real News, to have in-depth chats with workers about their lives and their jobs and their dreams and their struggles, and to provide a listening ear and a platform where they could share stories in ways that mainstream media never lets working people share, right? the digital world has enabled me to do that work. And I'm very, that's really kind of why I wake up in the morning, right? Is to build that solidarity and lift up those voices and report on the struggles of working people, right? And the last thing I would say is, Abby and all of our panelists talked about, the importance of supporting independent media, right? Think about why, we are saying that, not just because we are all members of independent media outlets, but we know that there is something in this model, right? The Real News Network, we don't take corporate advertising money, right? We are funded by our viewers, and we try to fundraise through foundations that support the kind of work that we are doing for, our regular small-time donors, right? We are beholden to the people that we serve, as is Project Censored, Empire Files, Mint Press News, right? When you are serving people who are sustaining you through that type of subscription model, and you're not beholden to kind of large top-down kind of entities that are telling you what to do, you have more freedom to do the journalism that everyone on this panel is able to do. You have more freedom to not be driven by just the sheer need to get as many clicks as you possibly can, right? And stir up as much controversy as you can, because that is the only way that you are going to survive. You have the ability to go in depth. You have the ability to push against the hegemonic narratives when you have that sort of bottom-up democratic support as a media outlet. And that is what I really wanted to underscore, right? Therein is yet another germ, a seed, a possibility for a different way of organizing the economies of knowledge and, the economy writ large. And we can see how the tangible benefits of that can really filter out if we commit to it, and if we can wrest this digital world from the claws of surveillance capitalism. And there's so much more that we can do, and we can't give up that fight. We cannot cede this terrain, right? We have to both build beyond the digital world, but we cannot leave the digital world to be completely surrendered to the forces that be, because we see where it's going. We see where it already is. We see how they have taken the utopian promises of the digital era and bastardized it to serve the ends of capital and the imperialistic ends of the American war machine, so on and so forth. So with that final thought, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us for these 3 live streams. I wanted to encourage you to continue to dream of an alternative future, because that is what we ultimately have to fight for, because the one that is currently, that we are on the path towards right now, is not good enough. It is not good enough. We know that. So we have to fight for another one, and we have to help each other imagine what another one will look like. And I hope that this live stream series, if nothing else, has at least sparked some sort of inspiration for those watching and those who watch in the future to try to imagine what that future could look like. So thank you again to everyone for watching. Thank you to Mickey Huff and Nolan Higdon from Project Censored for co-producing this live stream series with me, with Kayla Rivara, with Dwayne Gladden, our brilliant studio manager here at The Real News, who's been doing all these live streams after hours for the past 3 weeks when he's got a family life that he has to attend to, but he's done a brilliant job as always. Thank you to our other panelists, today, Manar Mahawish Adle, Abby Martin, Nolan Higdon. Thank you, Vina Dubal. Thank you, Meredith Whitaker and Robin Anderson. Thank you, Andy Lee Roth, Allison Butler, and John K. Wilson, and everyone for joining us, and everyone out there for watching. And once again, solidarity with the Palestinian people, and solidarity with everyone right now who is fighting for truth, justice, and a better world. Thanks so much, everyone. This is Maximilian Alvarez, editor-in-chief at The Real News Network. We'll see you again soon.